Thank you. I'm glad to have a chance to discuss these papers, although it's been very difficult to figure out how to do it relatively quickly. I thought I had 10 minutes yesterday, so I was up late last night trying to figure out what to cut, and now I have the added complication that I have a little bit more time than 10 minutes. So we'll see how it goes. I'm an economist, so the way I approach this is I'm trying to figure out what I can learn from theologians who take Catholic social teaching and the Christian tradition seriously. And so part of my talk is going to be saying how can we who are economists get access to what's being offered here. So one of the lines that I really appreciate from Oliver is that at one point in the paper, he says, theological ethics must know what it can do well and what it cannot. That was very refreshing coming from any practitioner of any discipline. And I could easily wonder if economists could say the same thing. Some of my comments will be along those lines, that economists must know what they can do well and what they cannot. And if you don't think about what you can't do well, you may not have a very good idea about what you can do well. So Professor O'Donovan puts his emphasis on engaging not in the practice of economists and their descriptions and analysis of the details of the economy, but he's engaging on a more general level, on what he calls the framework of ideas. And he uses a word in his paper, re-envisaging. We talk about to try to encourage economists to re-envisage some of the concepts that they use, particularly the ideas of exchange, to see it differently. This makes me a little nervous as an economist. We're not, to the extent that we know anything about postmodernism, it sounds suspiciously postmodern, that you're going to help me to see something differently, and we're a little suspicious that will lead to sort of wishful thinking. If you re-envisage it, it will make it so. And so that's just describing my first response to this project, that you need to see this differently. My second response to it is that things do look different in the light of the gospel. They're supposed to look different in the light of the gospel. You're supposed to see worldly realities differently than you would have seen them without it. And so it does raise the question, how might we see positive models and the normative categories we use differently? Are we missing anything important when we're thinking about how to deploy those models? A term I heard yesterday a couple times was deploying our models in the service of some greater good, of some common good. Well, how are we going to deploy them unless we have some idea about where they're falling short and where they're not? So this is what I'm looking for from theological ethics, particularly from Catholic social teaching, is am I missing something in the models that I'm using that is important, particularly when I try to deploy those models? So a model can be deployed in a couple different ways. Here's max U subject 2. As an aside to some of the things that were said last night, this may not be in every respect a utilitarian model, although there is a U in it. We could use some other letter to represent it. It's not. It doesn't assume that everyone's utility can be added up directly. It doesn't assume that U is some absolute measure, cardinal measure. But it does keep one of the most foundational assumptions of utilitarianism, which is that there is one objective of action, that utility is unitary, and this is a single-valued objective function and not a correspondence. Right? And so to that extent, economists are very much utilitarians. We think we've discarded that, but we've kept some of the most important parts of it. Whether that's good or bad is a different question, but we still are deploying a lot of utilitarian categories. So this model, just as a stand-in for other sorts of models, you might be your objectives as you see them. They may be your mistaken objectives. They may just satisfy the preference axioms and some representation theorem. But it is a model that is either useful or not to deploy towards certain ends. Now, just one other thing about yesterday, because I heard yesterday in another one of the talks from Jesus that economists don't use rational choice theory anymore. They use decision theory, and so we don't have to worry so much about whether the strong claims we're making. Because I've been interested in behavioral economics and its interaction with some of the Aristotelian categories, I've been trying to read a lot of decision theory textbooks. And to my mind, if economists are being taught decision theory, there are some good things about that. But in some sense, it can reinforce the confusion about positive and normative. When I was taught economics in the 80s, the rational choice model was a purely positive model. We're not claiming that this is true, and we make no normative claims about it. Right? So whether people actually decide in this way, or whether you should make decisions in this way, we're not going to take a position on this. This is the heart of our analytical framework. In decision theory, there's a curious reversal of this. In the chapters that you read on positive and normative decision theory, positive decision theories are about how people actually make decisions. The biases, the rules of thumb, and the normative decision theory, at least in the books I've been reading, is the rational choice model. It's an inversion of the way that I was taught it. That the way you should make decisions is to, as much as you can, to come up with a single valued objective function and understand your objectives and pursue them. Right? So substituting decision theory for rational choice theory actually makes me a little less comfortable. I was comfortable with the old way of doing it. So although as a positive model, understanding how people really make decisions, I think is important. So having said that, so if I want to deploy this model for just positive uses, prediction and explanation, we know that, at least I accept the force of much of this, that realism about what people are doing when they make a decision doesn't matter that much. I won't just say it doesn't matter at all, but it doesn't matter that much if what you're trying to do is to understand what's going to be the effect of this and have a framework of understanding the effect of a policy and how people are going to react to it. If you want to deploy it for normative or policy insight, then which means you're going to deploy it to figure out how to maximize the common good, or you're going to make judgments using this model and this framework of thought to talk about better, words like efficient, inefficient, then realism matters. The realism of the assumptions and the realism of whether this model captures what it's like to make a decision and act in the world and be a human being trying to make your way through the world does matter, because the terms better, efficient, maximize the common good are supposed to be referring to real people who have real interests. And so a model that can be a good positive model may in fact be a terrible normative model. Right? I think economists rely on the fact that if we get the positive model right, it's got to be a good normative model, because who wouldn't want a model that predicted well? But in normative analysis, you're not just trying to predict well. You want to predict well. You want to know what's going to happen if the minimum wage goes up. But you also are making decisions about what's good and what's bad and what's better. Right? And if you're referring to the decisions people are making in models and what it's like to make a decision, then you've got to get that right. Or to the extent you get that wrong, your model will not deploy very well to normative ends. Okay, so if you want to move from a positive model to a normative model, you have to ask, what are the shortcomings of the model in respect to reality? Economists, we're already aware of this. I teach labor economics, and I teach the labor-leisure trade-off. And as part of that, I give a little history of the welfare system in the United States. And we talk about the ways that can discourage work effort among those who receive welfare, because some of the highest implicit tax rates in the United States are on people whose incomes are going up and are on welfare programs because you earn another $100 of income and they take $60 away from your welfare benefit. So that's a very high tax rate, and not surprisingly, it may reduce work effort. So I can show that to my students, and I can talk about why they wanted to change the welfare system. But it occurred to me that within that model, I can't say why that's a bad thing for people, that their work effort is discouraged, because they end up having more leisure and not that much, more goods. It's actually on their own terms, and as we specify them in the model, they're better off. So if I want to talk about, well, here's the problem with welfare programs, I can't use the model itself to say, this is why this person's worse off. I have to make a judgment that I think this person, it's good to work, and it's bad to discourage people from working at these lower ages, even though they might choose that. So, so we're already aware in many situations that our models need something extra, and extra judgments if we're going to take them a little bit further. We have to add we have to bring them into touch with reality and not necessarily change the models themselves to have them be useful, right? If I want to understand the incentive effects, I don't necessarily have to have the model that will show why that's bad, but why it might be chosen. So, so when I read, this helps me to read O'Donovan, because I'm trying to figure out how should I look at Max U, subject 2, differently in this situation. And one of the things he mentioned at the beginning, when he talks about the reflexivity of preferences or of choice of the person, it occurred to me that I've written on some of the problems of the optimization model in light of Aristotelian practical wisdom. But this is something that I hadn't thought about, and it was useful to see this here. One of the things that we're assuming when we just posit a utility function or objective function, and then people trying to optimize it, is we're not assuming that anybody reflects on what that utility function is. Right? Professor Lawrence talks about this at the beginning when he talks about what a free act is. One of it is that you see the goods that you're pursuing as good. Well, we don't make any assumptions about that. You just happen to have a utility function that sort of drops on you, and you're trying to optimize it. So there's nothing reflective in it in that. So it's a useful question to ask. Well, who really are you if you're just a utility function and some algorithm for maximizing it? In what sense is it your utility function? It could be somebody else's utility function that you happen to care about. So there's a claim in the paper that I think is useful, at least for me, to say that choice without this kind of evaluation leads to this pleonexia or arrogancia. That if you don't reflect on what it is you're choosing and why you're choosing it, you're more likely to fall into these habits of not seeing the context, of seeing it perhaps as a ladder instead of as a mirror, to understanding what you're doing. Because the kind of questions that you'll ask are, well, what do I need? What do I want? Who counts? Who's around? Who do I owe something to? Who is in community with me? How does this affect the other people that I'm interacting with? And so I don't think you should build this into this model, but it's useful to understand that this is one of the things that might be missing in the economic model, and particularly when you start to employ it. So in general, when I see these sorts of limits to what economists do, my advice is not to try to modify the models so that they include all of this. I don't think a lot of this can be included. But I think it's very important for economists to be aware of the limits, because you can't just always count on Charlemagne to know everything about the wisdom. He may not have Alcuin on his side, making him a wise person. Sometimes the economist has to exercise some of the wisdom as well, unless you just want to be the only, as Russ said yesterday, that you can only be useful to people who are not economists, who are able to deploy your models and understand their limits. If you can understand their limits and you know the math, you can actually be quite useful as an economist in trying to help other people. Just one of the things that occurs to me in all these decisions about, well, what economists do and the precision is, in Aristotle's Ethics, he begins by arguing that precision is not to be sought for alike in all things, for it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits. And economists often blame others for not being precise enough. It may not be the fault of the others, although I think oftentimes it is. Sometimes it is that the subject matter itself can only be approached so precisely, or the kinds of precision that are necessary are different sorts of decisions. So then he takes this, and so I start out seeing this and saying, well, what would it be like if people were reflecting on their utility functions and their preferences, or what their goods, while they're deciding or before they're deciding? And within this, he talks about the importance of what he doesn't use a term, but I think in terms of sort of framing the context. What is competition? What are property? What are rights? How do you conceive of them? And how does that help you to think about what it is you're trying to pursue? The question I have here is Donovan makes the claim that it's possible to transcend competition in a market. It's possible not to just be trying to run the grocery store out of business by trying to get the best deal you can. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that possibility. I also notice in this point, there's sort of a danger of taking this to extreme, and I know we always worry about people taking market exchange and competition to an extreme. One of the things that encourages me is the economic research, a lot of it from experimental game theory, but also done in an anthropological context, that market exchange often has the characteristics not of mutual, each person trying to beggar the other, but there's a lot of reciprocity in market exchange. There's a lot of sense in which people approach it for whatever reason, recognizing whether it's a right or just a necessity that the other person be treated in some way that they receive a significant part of whatever surplus is involved in an exchange. For whatever reason, whether it's, well, I'm not going to be able to enter into very many exchanges if I'm always taking advantage of everybody, or just something that's become sort of a norm of their action, and particularly in competitive markets. So the other question I have about on the O'Donovan paper is, there's a sense that we need to rethink or re-envisage what's happening when we act in markets. I know oftentimes in theology and in other humanities, there's this sense that the system is creating the vision, and that's the only place it can be changed. My question is there a spirituality of this? In other words, we're always looking to find ways that systems are responsible or things should happen at some systemic level. What about at the parish and at the family and the government? Is it the government's job to design a system that creates these sorts of imaginaries, or is it something that, who should we be talking to about this really? I have a little bit less to say on the Lawrence paper. He offers two things. He offers something unusual from a theologian, economics, from Lonergan, which has this sort of evolutionary flavor to it. I have to say that I'm not going to comment much on it, except to note that economists who I respect who have looked at it, Paul Oslington I'm thinking about, say that the economics in it is respectable. It's somewhat unknown, somewhat still tied to some of the thinking in the middle of the last century about phases of growth and some of the Keynesian categories. But it's a respectable theory. I don't have a lot to say about it. What intrigued me about the paper was the promise that within this framework that we could see the role of subsidiarity and solidarity in the economy. Or we can make an argument about what would foster subsidiarity and solidarity. And that was what I was interested in. And let me just say a little bit about those two things. Let me talk about subsidiarity first. I think the fact that you have an ecological model, a model that's sort of trying to see the economy from the ground up, right? Seeing what's happening in those communities and what allows communities and individuals to flourish is a very useful perspective to see the economy. Although it's easy to start losing track of that once you get up at 30,000 feet and look at the economy as a whole, to lose track of what it is that the economy is really supposed to be serving, is those smaller communities. So I think he does make the point in the paper that subsidiarity is not just functional. And I think one of the big mistakes we make about subsidiarity is to think that it's just a division of labor sort of within organizations, and that activity should take place at those levels as close as possible to where people are can exercise their authority and their agency in that. But it's often thought that it's often claimed or implicitly that we do that because it's actually more efficient. And there are economic arguments about information and this information that's spread throughout the economy that make the case that subsidiarity would actually allow more productive use of that information and coordination of it. But subsidiarity is not just about function. It's about the support for communities, because communities flourish when they have purposes, and some of those purposes are very practical. And so allowing and fostering the production and coordination decisions at these local levels is important for those communities. Even if they don't do as well as could be done at some higher level. I think in terms of my children, or my students whose parents won't let them do things on their own because they're just too much of a knucklehead at this age and they won't do it right. And it's hard to see that if you need to let them do it, even if they won't do it as well, because there's something important going on when someone takes charge of their life, or at least that circle within which their community is operating. So I think I think the paper makes that point helpfully, of seeing subsidiarity not as just something that's sort of a functional outcome. The last point I want to make is a little bit about solidarity. There's only one line in the paper that mentions solidarity, and it seems to relate it fairly straightforwardly to growth. It says, when the market serves the overall well-being of society, the economic process serves social solidarity. So I was looking for again, I'm always looking for help on things like subsidiarity and solidarity, and what does that mean for how I think as an economist. I thought solidarity was a virtue, an individual virtue, and so I'm not sure what it means for solidarity to be served at some aggregate level. There may be requirements of solidarity, I'm not sure, but I think solidarity is something that's a claim on me in acting. And then I'm just not sure to what extent there has to be growth to have solidarity. Although in his discussion, he's talking about sort of the growth of culture. Does there have to be this sort of a cultural phase of growth for there to be solidarity? Can there be solidarity in in other sorts of circumstances, in destitution, for example? That's pretty much all I have to say.